The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, we'll look at the consequences of the U.S. and Israel's war with Iran and explore how the world has changed over the last 2 decades. Then we'll meet a Canadian children's author whose book wound up before the U.S. Supreme Court. Up first, our final Agenda interview with TVO's longtime foreign affairs analyst, Janice Stein. That's all ahead on the Agenda. One guest who's made frequent visits to our program since the very beginning is the one and only Janice Stein. She is, of course, the founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and Bellsberg Professor of Conflict Management at the University of Toronto. She's helped us navigate the muddy morass that is foreign policy, and we thought we'd invite her onto the agenda one last time to give us her insights into the state of the world before asking some others to join us as well for some more thoughts. Janice, great to have you here in this last week of our program.
So great to be here with you. See, we have looked at the world together for 19 years.
There's a bit of a setup here. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and then of course the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, I think many people who do what you do for a living thought this world is going to be a much nicer place going forward. This has not turned out to be the case. 9/11, the failure of the Arab Spring, the Middle East this week still on fire, Russia, Ukraine, political tribalism. One simple question before we ask the others to join us. Does it sometimes feel as if the world is no longer capable of making progress?
In all honesty, some days, yes, that's exactly how it does feel. But Steve, you have to ask, from whose perspective is it not making progress? For the vast majority of the world, having one big superpower hegemon that makes the rules did not always feel very good. So the diffusion of power to China, which represents 1 billion people and is the leading power in Asia, for those 1 billion Chinese, it feels very good. And in fact, it's all about progress for them. For India, it feels very good. There are large parts of Africa and South America that would say much better than when there was one capital city that made the rules. So people say this to me all the time. Our liberal values are in retreat. Democracy is in retreat. And yes, there are these periods in history. There's no question about it. But that's from our perspective. And
Meaning our Western perspective?
Our Western perspective. And I think what's very important to realize, the West, geographically, is now a minority in the world.
We're a minority in the world, but of course it's not atypical for people who live in the West and believe in the values of the West to think that, our way's the best way.
Yes,
and therefore, we don't feel like we're in ascension anymore, and that's not good for the whole planet.
Well,
are we entitled to feel that way?
No, that's exactly the logic chain. Our values are not particular to us and to our societies and to our cultures. They're universal. They are the right way for the whole world. Like the Catholic Church thought about itself at different points in its history. We are the arc of progress for the whole world. Well, the Catholic Church wasn't right, and I'm not convinced that we are right, but it's that sense of we are no longer ascendant. Our values are challenged by China, by Russia, by many others, frankly. We have problems in our domestic society that is leading to this malaise, to loss of confidence. And it's just, if you think about it a different way, it is just an awakening of the rest of the world who've grown while we were busy telling everybody that it was our way was the best way.
We're going to do one more thing here before we get everybody else to join us, and that is, you want to see what you looked like 31 years ago?
Oh, my.
Your debut on Studio 2 back in 1994. Sheldon, roll it.
seems to me there's something else going on here. And I must say, Eric, I find it tough to understand why you're so upset that the Americans are exercising influence and autonomy in Haiti. And now this is an American-run island, but you have trouble when the Russians go for their near abroad. There's a contradiction here. But it's beyond the near abroad. Look at the arms control proposals that came out. That's a quintessentially Russian set of proposals. One, seize the high ground. Two, put forward proposals that you have absolutely no chance of flying. Why do you do this? Because it appeases the Russian military and gives Boris Yeltsin a little bit of time to maneuver at home. Broaden the clout.
With your pals Richard Gwynn and Eric Margulies, and can you believe that's us?
I can't believe that's us. I just asked Steve how old was he then, and he answered the question, but he didn't ask me how old I was then, which is very gentlemanly of you.
Do you want me to? Because I know how old you are today. Anyway, Janice, you have been like a superstar. Answering the call for us time after time after time after time, and we're not done with you yet because we're going to invite some others to the table to continue the discussion about where we're at in foreign affairs in the world today. So stay tuned, okay?
I will.
Wars in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Canada's place in the world. Over 19 seasons of the agenda, we've revisited these themes time and again to help viewers understand the complex and often troubling times in which we find ourselves. And with the U.S. now involved in the war between Iran and Israel, all the more reason to do one final program on a world that often feels like it's gone berserk. So let's welcome Aaron O'Toole. He's the former leader of the Conservative Party of Canada and a former member of the Canadian Armed Forces. Arn Kislenko, professor of history at Toronto Metropolitan University, who also teaches international relations at Trinity College at the U of T. Doug Saunders, international affairs columnist at the Globe and Mail. And once again, Janice Stein from the Monk School at the U of T. And it's great to have you three along with the queen of all foreign affairs analysis here at our table today. Let me ask you, folks, who do you think was on our first ever show of the agenda back in September of 2006? Let me rephrase the question. Which one of the four of you do you think also appeared on that program 19 years ago? Yes, Professor Stein, let us, Sheldon, roll tape if you would. You're confusing me a bit here tonight. You're in favor of this war.
There's no question that I was in favor of removing the Taliban from power, and I don't agree with Eric that a government which was brutal in its treatment of minorities, brutal in its treatment of women, deserved to stay in place. However, I must say that that the bungling of the war, that the lack of strategy, well, by the United States first and then by NATO, the lack of strategy, the inability to address the fundamental economic roots of this is enough to make you tear your hair.
Okay. Well, she's on the first show and she's on almost the last show. What do you think, obviously we're talking Afghanistan there, what do you think this country has learned from our participation in that war?
You know, it's actually very relevant to the big decisions that are being made today. That war's had a tremendous impact. Forever wars are a disaster. Going in with ill-defined objectives and no clear sense of when you will leave and the replacement government that you will have in place is catastrophic. And in many ways, I think it undermines support for much of what our armed forces do. We had a very difficult period in Canada when Stephen Harper withdrew our forces from Afghanistan, partly because there was disappointment and a lack of clarity about what the purpose was. I think that's a really important lesson to take forward.
Aaron, you've worn the uniform. What do you think we learned from that war?
Well, we learned the hard lessons that the wounds of war stay with you for decades. We still have men and women suffering with mental health injuries from the Afghanistan war. 12 years, our longest deployment of the Canadian Armed Forces in our history. And as Janice pointed out, if you don't have a plan for once you've removed the Taliban, and you have to be committed for as long as it takes to have stability in that country. We did pull out a little too early. I remember when we had the parade in Ottawa and we thanked our men and women, the country was still not ready for a standalone democracy. And I think this is something leaders have to keep in mind is you need a plan for war, but also a plan for peace and stability after. And then that may not meet political timelines. But I'll tell you, that war did create a generation of talented officers within the Canadian Armed Forces who, by and large, are still there and are able to transition through this difficult time. So I think we should be proud of what we did, but it was a lot of blood and treasure, 158 of our citizens there and dozens afterwards. It's a price that's a steep one for a country.
Arn.
It taught us that history and culture really count, and that often decision makers don't think about that or put it on the back burner, where in fact in a country as complicated as Afghanistan, that was what really counted up front. I think it also showed us that when we expect our Canadian military to do things like that, both then and perhaps in the future, we got to be prepared to fund it. And we haven't done that since Afghanistan. So we are prepared to say things and even potentially to do things to put our men and women in harm's way and not provide them with the adequate resources to do that job. That's a big lesson.
Mm-hmm. Doug.
I think the lasting lesson for Canada and its allies from Afghanistan is kind of a piece with the lesson of Ukraine and possibly the lesson we might face in Taiwan, which is that if a people are wanting to overthrow a monster who has taken control of their country or tried to, the way to do it is not to send in your own soldiers to do it for them, no matter how well designed and how beneficially and so on, but it's to provide the legitimate movements of the people with the arms, the materials, the intelligence, and the money they need at a robust enough level to be able to do it themselves.
Let's continue our tour of the world with the Middle East. Janice, we talked on this program many years ago about the Arab Spring and what we thought was ushering in a new dawn for a more democratic Middle East. Clearly, that did not happen. Was it a blip? Was it anything more significant? How do you see it?
It's not a blip. If you spend time in the Middle East, there are many people in throughout the area, in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, who look at their governments and say, oh, we could do so much better than this. This is such a waste of human talent in our country. But how you do that when you have security services, Doug, that are so well funded. I mean, we just watched this in Iran. There was a very strong rally around the flag by Iranians who are very proud, Arn, and who have a really wonderful history. And so when you're attacked from the outside, you get that rally around the flag. But beneath that conversation was another one going on. This government has ruined this country for the last 30 years. Is this the moment? But how do you do that when you have a well-funded Basij and you have a well-funded Revolutionary Guard? What does it mean to provide arms and material? Because these people, even by taking to the streets, cannot withstand the power. They've tried 3 or 4 times. It's very hard.
Doug, I'm sure we have all talked to members of the Iranian community in this province and country in the last little while, and it's interesting. The traditional response one gets when a country is attacked is, well, we're going to pull together and we're going to repel. That's not what I'm hearing. I'm hearing, I hope this is going to lead to a revolution on the revolution. What are you hearing?
I spent Saturday night and Sunday morning of this past weekend as the U.S. bombs dropped, having text conversations with friends in Tel Aviv and friends in Tehran, all of them hiding in various basements and things like that, who interestingly were sort of united in the view of hoping that this causes a change of leadership in their country, but not necessarily that that's going to happen. I think the other view is that if the Iran war of 2025 proves to be something that ends in the summer of 2025, the major outcome of it will be that it was a military act to preserve the hold-on power by 3 men in Iran, Israel, and the United States, and that it didn't actually change anything, and that it probably hindered the prospects for a democratic, people-driven regime change in Iran.
Let me put that to you, Aaron. Is it too much to hope for that all of what's taken place over the last few days could lead to a public uprising and the throwing out of the mullahs?
It's certainly what I hope, Steve. And I've gotten to know the Persian community or the Iranian Canadian community in my political life. Because after Los Angeles, Toronto, I think, is one of the largest, second largest diaspora. And that's really the hope of people that have come here following the fall of the Shah throughout that history. And we've got to remember just how horrific this regime is. I helped lead the debate on declaring the IRGC as a terrorist entity. This is a force that downed an airline that killed 55 Canadians and permanent residents on it. Zahra Kazemi, a photojournalist, Professor Syed Omami, 2 Canadians murdered in Irvine prison, the infamous prison there. This is a bad actor, and I think there's been so much oppression within the country as well. The wider concern of a rippling war in the region is the concern and why caution must be exercised. But let's hope the potential of that country, a country that has great wealth, that has incredible demographics, and does have a history not too far back of a much more sort of liberalized country, not a democracy, but one that maybe aspires to that. So we've got to hope that's in the future. And this is what is sometimes a challenge for us, is parts of the world, going to Arndt's point, don't have a similar history and culture to us. And there may be longer term projects for human rights and development than we might be satisfied with here. But we have to try and work and cultivate that through aid, through diplomacy, and through security.
What are you seeing unfolding?
Well, us nerdy historians still talk about the French Revolution and World War I and the lasting effects there. So to Janice's point, when people say the Arab Spring and related developments are dead, I think that's ridiculous. They're ongoing. We in the West are a bit arrogant, frankly, in analyzing other countries and assuming these things that we want to see happen. There was a retrenchment of authoritarianism in the Middle East following 2011, that's for sure. But then you have some celebrated cases like Syria, where a regime was toppled. It's just that we don't know what we're dealing with next. So when it comes to Iran, as optimistic as I am, and I certainly share Aaron's conviction that it's a regime none of us terribly like, we don't know what's coming next. And I think it's a bit naive of us to assume that we're going to get the westernized sort of Persian community that lives in North York running the show there. I don't see that at all. As a matter of fact, I would argue probably the opposite. You're going to see a regime that is still abundantly Persian, that has regional aspirations, that still controls a whole host of independent actors, semi-independent actors in the region that could do sizable damage. And they're proud people. So I think we got to get away from this notion that, like Donald Trump is espousing, that somehow we're going to see a democratic, peaceful transition. I don't see that, not in the immediate sense, certainly.
If I could just make one other comment, which will be unpopular, because there's so many different cultures in this region. And I don't think there's a single leader in power in the Middle East who didn't look at that military operation.
Absolutely.
Meaning what?
They are impressed by it. They look at that and they say, oh, wow, right? You can fly that number of aircraft that far, getting under the radar.
And you've embedded the regime to the extent that you have that type of, as I said earlier about it, it was tactically brilliant and perhaps strategically lacking.
But the tactical brilliance will matter to every leader in that region who are impressed by that tactical brilliance. So I think the United States paradoxically comes out of this as the dominant external power in the region as a result.
Despite them having spent the last decade trying to move out of the region.
Correct. There's a famous aphorism. You may think you're finished with the Middle East, but the Middle East is never finished with you.
Well, okay, let's pick up on that then. We have all around this table seen rises and falls, better days and worse days for the prospects of peace between Israelis and Palestinians for a very, very long time. Aaron, is it fair to say that this may be the worst time in memory? Short of all-out war like we saw in 1967 and 73, and this feels like it's as bad as it's ever been. When you watch what's going on over there right now, what do you think?
Yeah, it's hard to watch, and with these counterinsurgency operations, you end up, after you've sort of accomplished your objective after the horrible attacks in the previous October, you're then really just going to be constantly putting out small fires that pop up or going after small targets, and the collateral damage or the potential for collateral damage is extreme, and that over time will weigh on your allies and support. So it's a careful balance that I think Israel has to strike. They needed to root out a horrific threat to their existence that was being funded in part by Iran and other bad actors. But keeping that balance towards the longer term goal of peace and some sort of peaceful solution of a two-state. But the challenge has always been the two-state solution. There's one state that's a democracy that expresses an interest in it, and there's so many external forces interfering with the ability for there to be some resolution from the Palestinian side. That's what when I toured the region, that was the biggest impression I was left with is people want this, but a lot of people don't want resolution either. And it's something I think we have to work with as a strong friend and ally of Israel. But also we want to see peace, and we want civilians to be able to rebuild their lives. So
absolutely. But to talk of a peace process between Israel and Palestine right now, Arne, feels like, I mean, it's a cruel joke. There's no peace process. There's not going to be a peace process for a very long time.
Yeah, certainly not with the status as it exists now, and certainly not with the players who are behind the scene, including the Israeli Prime Minister. I just don't see the math there, to be honest with you. But if you take an even broader view, and certainly Janice is more expert than I on this, there's so many players in what we call the Middle East. It's not just Israel and Palestine. You have to consider this enormous potential void or chaos in Syria, Iraq, which is perpetually unstable, even if we pretend otherwise, Turkey. I mean, there's a lot, Saudi Arabia. There are wars, of course, going on. They're independent or semi-independent actors with Hamas, Hezbollah, none of which are committed to peace, even in our wildest dreams. So that really troubles me. And then on top of that, the nation that we're looking to most for leadership external to the region, the United States, in my opinion, certainly lacks any coherent policy. It isn't really driven by expertise or knowledge. Not that ever actually achieved peace in the region in the first place, but it seems to be kind of haphazard. It seems to be off of the cuff of one man in particular.
Is this as bad as you've ever seen it there?
Just in terms of the humanitarian situation,
Yes.
among Palestinians in Gaza, of course, is the headline number. The number of deaths and the lack of food aid and so on is a problem. But among Israelis as well, who did suffer the largest pogrom and mass atrocity of the 21st century in 2003. And there's a lack of leadership interested in pursuing a peace process. I think the elements have always been there. Saying a two-state solution is a bit of a misleading term. There are two states. One of them just has not been fully acknowledged or recognized. There's currently discussions among Britain and France and Canada to unilaterally recognize Palestine as an advance move rather than what has been the case for the last 30 years, which is to wait till after. But that's partly because both the United States and Israel are led by people who are not interested in the peace process.
Let me get one last comment from you on this part of the world, and that is, I remember you and I and Ed Lutwak in this studio probably 25 years ago, and he used an expression that I want to ask you about tonight, and that is, he said, sometimes it's a very good thing to have a quote-unquote clarifying war. Because people look at things differently after you've had a clarifying war. Is there an argument for that here?
There just might be. I mean, let me just say what I think Doug was saying, only more strongly. This is the worst time for Palestinians, the worst in the last 75 years. And no matter how bad the trauma was that was inflicted on October the 7th, and it is really bad and it's ongoing, it doesn't justify. There are no military objectives that are served, and there are no political objectives. It is the total absence of a political strategy. So why do I have just a tiny ray of optimism? Because we have the most brutal president of the United States we've ever had. And this morning, when he thought that Iran and or Israel broke the ceasefire, he took the gloves off. with those two governments. And he phoned the Israeli Prime Minister and he used an expletive, which I don't think we're allowed to use on the show. It's too bad that we're not there yet.
Give it a try. See what
Well,
happens.
WTF is going on. Call your planes back. And the Prime Minister did it. There is an underlying change now. Netanyahu farmed out, in exchange for those raids, he farmed out and ceded control to Donald Trump. I think there's a possibility, were he interested, and this is the real, were the U.S. president, this one, interested at all in strong-arming both sides now, because Hamas is weaker than it's ever been. He's lost his big patron. There is an opportunity if he were interested.
Okay.
Whether he is, that's a different question.
Let's move on to
patience, yes.
Let's move on to Europe then and now. We're going to go back to an episode. This one's from 11 years ago. Russian troops had moved into Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula, and here's how we talked about it on this program then. Sheldon, if you would. I like simple questions, so let's start simple. Why has Russia done what it's done?
Well, I think some people have been saying because it can. But I think, President Putin considers the future of Ukraine something that Russia can't ignore. It's a vital interest. He was worried about Crimea. He saw an opportunity where the West had sort of let things slip. There was a gap between our rhetoric and what we were ready to do, and he moved very quickly.
Okay, and to today. Arne, the West obviously sees Russia as having committed an illegal, immoral, world destabilizing military war against Ukraine. Just for argument's sake, is there another different, legitimate interpretation of what's going on there now?
The loaded word there was legitimate. Certainly if you take a Russian perspective or Putin's perspective, everything the West thinks is totally wrong. This was an act of, pure self-defense against the aggressive expansion of NATO. It was Western encroachment in Ukraine. It was Ukrainian fascism. All of this, for me personally, and obviously my colleagues here will either agree or disagree, this is propaganda. This was an absolutely illegal, illegitimate invasion of a sovereign people. All of that rhetoric is really a toxic mix of Putin's own personal experience, the demise of the Soviet Union, fears of Western encroachment for sure. He did see, and many Russians do see, NATO as expanding, and that is against Russia's interests. But it's even more complicated than that. It's this long, steep T of Russian history, of the Mirsky, this idea of Ruski Mir, of a Russian worldview, of the near abroad. There's not one thing that is motivating Putin and what's happened in Ukraine, but I find it terribly ironic that today he is trying to leverage himself as a peace broker in the Middle East when his soldiers have engaged in nothing but a horrific invasion and occupation and murderous behavior in that country. So,
how relevant do you think NATO has been throughout all of this?
It is finding a need to be relevant quickly. And we're seeing that this week with meetings to try and make Europe a lot more self-reliant on defense, and to make sure that in a world where you're going to see many conflicts all at once and a retreating United States, Europe needs to really be the backbone of NATO that it hasn't been. And let me give a shout out to this show, Steve, as you're in your final days. I remember seeing an Applebaum on your show several times talking about the Holodomor, and then talking about the illegal invasion of Crimea, which we addressed in the Harper government, where Prime Minister Harper was actually pushing the G8 to be the G7 because of that conduct by Putin, and then pushing Germany, particularly Chancellor Merkel, who was allowing the energy importance of Russia to have Europe almost accede to some of this. And Putin has demographic challenges. They're at their peak military now, and they're eroding it quickly, and he wants to control his near abroad, and that's Ukraine, but it's also the Baltics. And so we had to stand up, or it wasn't going to end with Crimea. We saw that with the full invasion. So NATO really has to show its relevance. And I remember a few years ago, the first term of President Trump talking about pulling out of NATO. President Macron called NATO brain dead. I'm glad NATO is coming back from the dead, because we're in a dangerous world, and alliances are good for peace and stability and are critical to Canada. So Canada plays a critical role in being this linchpin between North America and Europe.
I know everybody at this table, and surely everybody in the Ukrainian community remembers Stephen Harper going right up to Vladimir Putin at one of those summits and saying, you got to get out of Ukraine. Might have been the first world leader to tell him so to his face. You still giving him props all these years later for doing that?
Canadians have led the way, partly because we have one of the largest Ukrainian diasporas in the world. It's important in discussing NATO in this context to clear the air of what you correctly identified as Russian propaganda, which is the idea that NATO had anything to do with Russia's reasons for invading Ukraine. I was in Ukraine a lot during the decade before Russia's 2014 invasion of not just Crimea but Donbass. And during that period, after 2008, there were no Western countries interested in having Ukraine join NATO, and there were no political parties capable of being elected in Ukraine interested in joining NATO. This idea coming out of Russia that there was a NATO country, people in Ukraine were interested in joining the European Union and the community of democracies, and that was what triggered Vladimir Putin. And in a way, it's been healthy of NATO to step back and, as I said earlier, say we're going to provide material, we're going to provide arms and support, not just because we're worried about NATO obligations causing us to be engaged in a war with Russia, but because actually it's the better way to deal with this.
We are a little more than 5 minutes to go here, and I want to make sure we get a reasonable amount of time to discuss one last thing here. We've had 3 prime ministers of Canada during the time this program's been on the air: Harper, Trudeau, Carney. And each in their own way has pledged to make Canada one of those countries that punches above its weight on the international stage. Janice, have we been?
Well, when we look at our assets, they've degraded over this period, right? Under all 3, frankly, less defense spending. This is not something that happened in the last 10 years. Less development assistance. So if you look at the hard and a leaner, not necessarily meaner global affairs department, but leaner too. Relatively speaking, its budget has shrunk, and other parts of government have been funded. So if you look at the assets we deploy, no, we haven't. But there's a rhetoric that we use when we tell ourselves stories about ourselves in the world, and we constantly talk about Canada in the world. Like my other 3 colleagues, I spend a lot of time out of the country, at meetings or with colleagues. You have to work really hard to bring up Canada's name. You will have a whole evening, frankly, if we're being honest, of discussion. And I might be the only one at the end of it who raises Canada, and they're polite, and oh yes, right? And in many conversations, Canada is simply not at the table. Now, this government is, again, talking about making Canada matter. It is investing in defense, finally. Finally, it is investing in defense. If that's going to have to come out of some other part of the budget, and it may be the development assistance budget, because that's what they did in the UK. That's not a US story. That's exactly what Keir Starmer did in the UK. But I think we have to be very careful. We are a small to medium country that shares a continent with a big elephant, as Pierre Trudeau has to say.
Okay, but I do remember the days when Ronald Reagan, before taking major international decisions, used to call his buddy Brian Mulroney and say, what does Canada think about this? No one does that anymore, Aaron, do they?
But that was personal.
They don't. Janice is right, it was personal, and Brian Mulroney took a great effort to make sure that he built those personal ties and relations with the U.S. And he used to say to me when I was Conservative leader, the 2 most important decisions for a Canadian Prime Minister: national unity and relations with the United States.
Right on.
So Canada, as Janice said, if we want to return to more relevance as leader of a middle power, we have to equip a smarter diplomatic corps. We have to engage in aid. The migration crisis and everything we're seeing, some of the solution to that is not backing away from aid, and military. So we have to be able to really deliver the 0.7% for ODA, the 2% or plus this week on defense. Then when we're able to attend these sessions, or when we run for the the rotating seat on the Security Council, we're actually paying our dues. And we haven't been. And it's all three prime ministers for the time of the agenda haven't lived up to that. At times, we've stepped up individually within that, but consistency has been lacking. And so let's really, the world needs more Canada, but Canada needs more Canada.
Mm-hmm. The world needs more Canada was something we used to hear said all the time. You see that poster at bookstores, right?
Yeah.
At Indigo. The world needs more Canada. The world doesn't feel like it needs more Canada these days. It doesn't. No. Canada doesn't seem to be missed on the international stage.
No, it's not. I found what Janice said very funny because I get it too, right? As Canada, they're very polite when you're abroad, but we're not significant. And let's cut right to the chase. I think those three governments, maybe other ones would have been different, but those three squandered any opportunity we had, any status that we may have had at the end of the Cold War moving forward. Canada has become relegated to a second fiddle in a lot of ways.
Do we mind that?
I don't think many Canadians really are that engaged in the international spectrum, to be honest with you. So I'll tell you why. What Aaron said is really important. I would be amongst the many, I think, at least in my fields, that would say we need more NATO spending. And people always look at you like you're a war hawk or something like that. But it's not. NATO, our NATO commitment is indicative of our multilateral commitments in a much broader exercise. Obviously, our relationship with the United States hinges on that too. And it is facing the reality of a dramatically difficult world in which we live. We didn't get to it, of course, but Arctic sovereignty tops the list here in Canada. Border security. These are things which most Canadians get really nervous, anxious about. They don't want to talk about it because it sounds like a sort of American narrative when we start talking like that. But that's the reality we've crafted since the end of World War II, Steve. Canada was a founding member of NATO and many other
when we had the fourth biggest navy in the world at that time.
And what about peacekeeping? Like Canadian peacekeepers were, of course, celebrated, and rightly so, for many, many years, and now we're amongst the poor of contributors to it.
I want Doug's view on this. Should we aspire to play a greater role on the world stage?
There was a sobering moment during Justin Trudeau's first term as Prime Minister, shortly after Donald Trump won the U.S. election, when his government realized that we were unable to carry out a lot of our international agenda because we are dependent on the United States supporting us, and not just in defense and in trade and the things we tend to think about, but we were unable to do the things we wanted to do in China and India and places like that because the United States was not on our side. And we got caught up in bad situations with those countries that were immediately resolved when more normal government came to the United States. Whether that happens again, we don't know. And I think the last decade has been a lesson for Canadian governments, really of both parties, that we need to forge an independent route. That doesn't mean we're going to become a member of the European Union or something like that. But it means that our membership in collective defense alliances like NATO or whatever succeeds it if it falls apart, is going to have to be more than just a way to spend less money. Collective defense alliances are an important way to spend less money on defense. It's a way to share burdens. But that we actually are going to have to start spending money on things.
We're going to fulfill a tradition on this program right now, which is Janice Stein always gets the last word. We have a minute to go, Janice, and not more than a minute. Tell me one thing. I don't know anybody in this country who thinks, you know what, when George Bush went into Iraq, we should have gone in too. There's nobody in this country who thinks that. But I bet there are people in this country who think, you know what, here's one thing Canada should have done over the years that we didn't do. What should that thing have been?
Well, I think Arn put his finger right on it. We don't know what is under our waters, over our airspace, or on land in our own north. Right? That's frankly shocking. That is just shocking. That is not more Canada in the world. We're just very fortunate that NATO and the United States in the lead have agreed to count that as defense spending. But we have not invested in the resources to know what is going on in our north, nor have we built the partnerships with our Indigenous peoples. There's no other way to say it, but that's frankly a disgrace.
That was job one that we didn't do that we should have done.
Yes.
Our own backyard.
Is it too late to do it?
No. it is not too late to do it. But if you think about it in terms of where the world is going right now, that has become a frontline problem for NATO, and we are at the front line. So let's put our own house in order before we talk about some grandiose vision of what we can do in the world.
Okay. Christine, how much time I got left? 20 seconds? That's enough time to thank everybody, I think. Yes, indeed. Okay, Aaron O'Toole, former leader of the Conservative Party. Doug Saunders, international affairs columnist, Globe Mail. On the other side of the table, Arne Kislenko, professor of history, TMU. And the one and only Janice Stein. There she is, Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. So great to have the four of you around this table tonight for this.
And thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
For 19 years.
It's been a joy. It's been a joy.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody. It's been a joy. How did a Canadian children's book about a puppy lost during a pride parade land before the U.S. Supreme Court? The question isn't so out of place these days in our culture war-obsessed society, which happened to ensnare our next guest. Robin Stevenson is the author of more than 30 books for children and teens, including Pride Puppy. And she joins us now on the line from Vancouver Island, British Columbia, to tell us all about her saga. Robin, good to meet you. How are you doing tonight?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
A pleasure. Describe Pride Puppy for us, if you would.
Sure, yeah. It's a rhyming alphabet book that tells the story of a family going to a pride parade with their toddler and baby, or little kid and toddler, and their puppy. And the puppy gets lost at the parade, and the community of folks at the parade help reunite the family and the dog. And it's a rhyming alphabet book, so it begins A for awake, animals and all, B is for breakfast, and baby and ball, and so on. And it's a little different than some alphabet books because it does actually tell a little bit of a story, but it's a very simple story. They go to Pride. The dog gets briefly lost. They find the dog. They go home. So it's a very simple story, but it's beautifully illustrated by Julie McLaughlin. It's very colorful, it's very vibrant, and it provides a glimpse of the sort of diverse community that celebrates Pride parades, and is very much inspired by our Pride parades out here on the West Coast.
In fact, for those of us who are watching on television or on their computers or whatever, Sheldon, bring this up if you would, because we're going to show a little sample of what here. Now, we're at E now in the alphabet. E is for everyone under the sun, and then F is for feathers, for flags, and for fun. And you're right, Julie McLaughlin's pictures are quite beautiful. So tell us why you felt the need to write this book.
Yeah, so I've been going to Pride celebrations for at least 35 years. I went to my first Pride events in Toronto when I was still in high school. And after I had a kid myself, my partner and I took our kid to Pride every year. We usually met up with my parents. And my parents actually marched in Toronto Pride back in the 90s with the group P-Flag after I came out as queer. So, you know, Pride's been a big part of my life for a very long time. I love Pride celebrations, and I think they're a great chance for kids to see that there's lots of different kinds of families out there. And for kids from families like mine with two moms, a chance to see that there's lots of families like theirs out there as well. And our Pride parades out here on the West Coast are just these, you know, wonderful, wonderful events. And when my own kid was little, there actually weren't any books about Pride for young kids, but it's an event that, you know, many families go to every year. And I thought that there should be a book that reflected that celebration. So that was sort of where the idea for the book came from.
I should ask you, you know, since we're going back 30 years when your parents first started participating in these things, whether that was considered a bit of a gutsy thing to do back then.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. If I think about certainly, you know, being in high school or being a teenager and young adult back in those days, there really was no representation at all. Which, so for me, you know, I think Pride became particularly important because it was one of the few places where you actually got to see that there was this huge community of folks out there. And, you know, I'm very grateful now that we do have more representation, that there are so many more books than there used to be, and very grateful for all the work and advocacy over the last decades that has brought that about. So, you know, despite the fact that we're dealing with this backlash and book bans and so on, you know, the reality is that books like this just didn't exist when I was a young person, or even when my kid was born. So, you know, there's something to celebrate there, and that we do actually have these books now.
Well, let's cut to the chase here. How is it that this ended up a case before the United States Supreme Court?
Yeah, so this is a case that began in late 2022. A school district in Montgomery County, Maryland, decided to adopt a number of picture books with LGBTQ plus characters as part of an effort to diversify their curriculum and make sure that all the kids and families in their community were represented in the books on their shelves and in their classrooms. Some parents objected to the inclusion of these books and began protesting. That was actually when I first learned about the case. I suddenly started getting a lot of online hate. And didn't know where it was coming from, so sort of started Googling and found that these protests were happening in Maryland, and Fox News had covered the story and had really focused, on Pride Puppy. So that was how I initially found out about this. Then in spring of 2023, three of those parents, or three couples, filed a lawsuit with the support of the Beckett Fund, a conservative religious law firm that has taken on many cases that have sought to undermine LGBTQ plus rights in the States. They had taken on this case and were wanted the right to opt out. They wanted to be warned in advance if these books were going to be used in the class or talked about, so that they could take their children out of school for that, or out of the class for that reading or for that discussion. And that lawsuit worked its way up through the courts over the last couple of years. And in January, we learned there's 9 books involved in this case. So in January, we learned that the Supreme Court had agreed to hear this case. And in April, the case went before the Supreme Court.
Now, I don't think the United States Supreme Court televises its hearings, but they do allow audio. And as a result, we're going to play a little snippet here. This is an exchange of oral arguments at the U.S. Supreme Court. We've got an exchange between Justice Neil Gorsuch, one of the Supreme Court judges, and the attorney for Montgomery County Schools. So let's play that. Sheldon, if you would.
Pride Puppy was the book that was used for the pre-kindergarten curriculum. That's no longer in the curriculum.
That's the one where they are supposed to look for the leather and things and bondage, things like that.
It's not bondage. It's a woman in a leather...
Sex worker, right?
No.
No?
That's not correct. No.
I read it.
It's a drag queen and
drag queen and drag
correct.
queen.
The leather that they're pointing to is a woman in a leather jacket, and one of the words is drag queen in the survey.
And they're supposed to look for those.
It is an option at the end of the book, correct?
Yeah, okay. And you've included these in the English language curriculum rather than the human sexuality curriculum to influence students. Is that fair?
Were you listening to this live by chance?
Yeah, I was listening to this live.
What'd you think?
It was utterly surreal. Honestly, there had been a lot of misrepresentation of Pride Puppy over the last couple of years. That was, pretty widespread in right-wing media. Some of it was, sort of got increased. It began with the lawyers. It was so right on I think it was a sort of key strategy of the law firm in this case was this misrepresentation of the book, and it did get increasingly bizarre over the 2 years leading up to the case, and increasingly removed from anything that was actually in the book. But I honestly, I almost fell off the couch. I really did. It didn't occur to me that they wouldn't actually read the books.
Well, let's take a look here.
He does say he read the book. He does say he read the book.
Yeah.
I don't understand how it's possible that he read the book and came away with that interpretation. L is indeed for leash. The leash belongs to the dog. There is a leather jacket. Again, this is a fairly common fashion choice. It's just a piece of outerwear. It's not that unusual. It's definitely not an indication of bondage or sex work. And for me, it's bizarre to read a children's book and, come up with that kind of interpretation. So, but yes, there was a lot of misinformation leading up to it, but I really thought that the Supreme Court justices would actually read the books that were involved in the case. These are books that take, less than 5 minutes to read. I was really shocked.
Sorry, Ram, do you have any idea where he got the notion that what we just saw, which was a dog on a leash and a bunch of people behind the dog and a kid in a wheelchair, which is you know, you don't always see physically disabled people portrayed in books, so it's kind of nice to see that as well. Do you know where he got the, what he clearly thought was more nefarious interpretation of what was going on?
You know, I've seen so many different people online speculating about where he got it from, and I've seen people come up with various explanations. I don't know what he was thinking. I mean, I think that it is certainly something that had been pushed by right-wing media for a couple of years. You know, some of the things that people had said about the book were so there's a number of items on each page that start with a different letter of the alphabet. So, for example, like on the Z page, there's a child's hoodie with a zipper on it. And so some of the people writing about the book over the couple of years leading up to the case would say things like, this book includes images of leather and zippers, linking the items to imply that those two things are somehow connected and that there's some kind of sexual content. In fact, it's a parent in a leather jacket on one page and a kid's sweater with a zipper on it on another page.
Well, in fact, the judge says something to the effect of, you're trying to influence, quote unquote, kids by portraying things in a certain way. What did you interpret that to mean?
Yeah, well, that was very interesting because in the earlier part of the arguments, they also focused on the book Uncle Bobby's Wedding, which is a story by Sarah Brannon about a little girl whose uncle is getting married, and she's worried that he's not going to have as much time to hang out with her anymore. And the mom kind of reassures her, and, you know, he gets married, he marries another man. And with respect to that book, they also argued that because the wedding was a happy occasion, that this was somehow coercive, that this was an attempt to tell children what to think, to tell them that it was okay for men to marry other men. That just the portrayal of a happy marriage was somehow coercive. So it really seemed, listening to the oral arguments, that they were suggesting that any representation of LGBTQ people in a book that showed them living their lives, being happy, having a nice day at a parade, getting married, that any of those kinds of representations were somehow an attempt to influence or coerce children to believe certain things.
You know, it's a reasonable question to ask, at what age do you introduce some of the concepts that the book is dealing with, or not dealing with for that matter, to young people? But it doesn't sound like when kids read this book, they are inferring that there is something sexual about the content in the book. Why do you think that adults seem to take that interpretation? Some adults.
I think some adults apply a very different standard to us LGBTQIA people and families than they do to other families. So a family with two moms is no more sexual content than a book about a family with a mom and a dad. You know, I have an earlier book called Pride Colors, which is a board book that includes a photo of a baby with two moms. And people who attempted to ban that book in Virginia referred to the book as pornographic and sexually explicit because it includes a photo of a baby with two moms. Kids who read that book just see a photo of a family. And I think, you know, the same with Pride Puppy. When I read this book to kids, they focus on, they want to tell me their dog's name. They want to tell me what kind of ice cream they like. They want to tell me if they have a connection to Pride, if they've been to a Pride parade. They want to tell me about their grandma because there's a grandma in the book. You know, they don't come up with the kind of interpretations that Neil Gorsuch or right-wing media are coming up with. But I think it's, you know, the some of the adults who are reading the book and who really have a hard time thinking about queer people and families without sexualizing them that are coming up with these interpretations.
I gather the province of Alberta recently announced some new standards for determining what kinds of books are appropriate for school libraries. We don't have to go into chapter and verse about what those standards say, but what do you think of them?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think that what we're seeing in Alberta is very much following the same playbook that we've seen in the U.S. over the last few years. And this situation with Pride Puppy really kind of came in the middle of an epidemic of book bans in the States that's continuing to escalate. And the playbook that we've seen in the U.S. is very much the same that we're seeing in Alberta now. Parents have always been able to go to their kids' teachers and say, I have a concern about this topic or this book, and have that conversation. That's not what we're seeing now. This is a very organized, well-funded political campaign where these book bans are being used to target marginalized communities, LGBTQ plus folks. In Alberta, this wasn't a few local parents who raised this concern. This was the group Action for Canada, who are very much modeled on groups like Moms for Liberty in the U.S. They're anti-public schools. Their website says that schools are damaging children, encourages parents to pull their children out of schools, encourages people to homeschool according to Christian principles. They're not supporters of public schools. They're not involved in public schools. They're an anti-immigrant group. They're Islamophobic. Their website is full of conspiracy theories. They're blatantly anti-LGBTQIA. I think that this is not a group that should be influencing curriculum choices or library collections. And I think that, Alberta's government, if they want to talk about curriculum, if they want to talk about library collections, should be engaging with librarians and teachers who have the training and skills and experience to make those decisions and curate those collections for the schools and to provide advice about book selection, not listening to a group which has been, promoting hate and undermining public education.
The name of the book, one more time, is Pride Puppy. We invite people to take a look at it for themselves and make their own decisions. And Robin Stevenson, the author, we are grateful you spent some time with us here on TVO tonight to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, June 24th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, how far has medicine advanced in the last 19 years that the agenda's been on the air? Tune in tomorrow to find out. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.